Hey there, pirates. Welcome aboard the Anime No Mi channel. Zoro had his eye cut during his training in One Piece, and there's a reason for that. Guys, let's start sharpening the blade of this theory with the first encounter between Zoro and Mihawk, which planted the seed for everything. Mihawk appears like a lone hawk in Chapter 51 during the Beratie arc, where he humiliates Zoro in a duel that lasts less than the blink of an eye. Zoro, with his 3 swords and iron will, attacks with everything he has, but Mihawk cuts through him like rice paper, leaving a massive scar on his chest and telling him he's still a frog in a well. That wasn't just a defeat, it was a free lesson. Mihawk saw potential in Zoro, but warned him that the path to the top is paved with pain and sacrifice. Zoro swore to surpass his master, and from that point on, every wound he received became a step toward that final confrontation. But the eye? That comes later, during the time skip, when Zoro asks Mihawk for training in Chapter 597. He swallows his pride and begs his rival to become his mentor, and Mihawk accepts, taking him to his dark island. Post-time skip, in Chapter 599, Zoro reappears with a fresh scar over his left eye, closed like a well-kept secret. The theory says Mihawk purposely cut that eye during training, not by accident, but as a way to teach Zoro to see beyond physical sight, forcing him to rely on instinct, haki, and sheer willpower, turning a weakness into ultimate strength. Now, let's sharpen that idea by asking why Mihawk would choose the eye as a target. Mihawk isn't your typical sadistic manga master. He's the Zen sword saint, living on an island full of warrior gorillas, as seen in Chapter 597, where Zoro trains among beasts that push him to evolve. The training is brutal, and Mihawk knows that to surpass the best, Zoro must lose something precious. Back in Chapter 51, Mihawk already showed his philosophy. True power comes from overcoming your limits. Cutting Zoro's eye would be an extreme way of enforcing that, a test of resilience. Zoro, who in Chapter 3 had already lost to Kuina because of a perceived weakness, learns that physical handicaps don't stop a true swordsman. In Chapter 1033, during Wano, Zoro awakens Conqueror's Haki, infusing his swords with an aura that cuts even the indestructible. And this happens only after his training with Mihawk. That suggests the loss of his eye was the catalyst that pushed him to focus on inner sight, similar to advanced observation Haki that predicts movements. Mihawk, the master of black blades, knows that eyes can deceive. By taking one away, he forces Zoro to see the world through his soul. Before anything else, it's important to understand the context of the island where Zoro trained under Mihawk. It wasn't just any island, it was a place full of natural forces and wild predators that, alongside Mihawk, challenged Zoro in ways only a master like him could plan. Mihawk's island is marked by its savage nature and the presence of dangerous creatures, reinforcing the idea that Zoro's training wasn't simple or conventional. There, he faced extreme conditions and a hostile environment where his senses were constantly tested. Now, let's return to the initial idea. What if Zoro's eye cut wasn't a direct action by Mihawk, but rather a consequence of the creatures on that island? This new angle opens up the possibility that the scar wasn't a deliberate lesson from Mihawk about overcoming weakness, but rather a reflection of the chaotic and brutal environment Zoro was in. Maybe it wasn't Mihawk who directly caused the injury, but a series of unpredictable events involving wild creatures and extreme situations that culminated in the cut. Remember that Mihawk's island is populated by many ferocious beasts, and throughout the manga, it's shown that Mihawk deeply understands the wild and its dangers, able to deal with them effortlessly. He might have placed Zoro in situations where he had to face non-human opponents, possibly powerful creatures inhabiting the island, and one of them could have dealt the blow that scarred his eye. These creatures could easily have been the ones that challenged Zoro and tested his skills in an entirely new way. Perhaps while training among these monsters, Zoro pushed himself too far, and one of them managed to hit him unexpectedly. That wouldn't mean Mihawk's training failed. Rather, it would represent Zoro's evolution. He was learning to handle chaos, unpredictability, and the reality that, in the real world, you can't always rely on sight or heightened senses to survive. That cut, then, could have been an indirect but deeply meaningful lesson about Zoro's need to adapt. He was, in truth, learning to see beyond physical senses. Mihawk, as a mentor, might have recognized that potential and guided him through that evolution. He knew Zoro needed real challenges, not just controlled training. The island's beasts, therefore, would serve as a way to test Zoro's endurance, showing him that a true swordsman must go beyond what the eyes can perceive. Moreover, the idea that Zoro's eye cut was a kind of simulation of death gains strength when we consider Mihawk's philosophy and the type of training he provided. Mihawk is a swordsman who views battle as a dance between life and death, and he has always operated in the shadows. By exposing Zoro to wild, uncontrollable threats, Mihawk forced him to enhance his perception in an unconventional way. That cut wasn't merely a physical loss, but a symbolic one, a temporary failure, a necessary sacrifice for greater evolution. By losing his eye, Zoro was forced to find a new way to see without truly seeing, using his other senses, especially Haki. Here's where another interesting point comes in: Zoro's development of observation Haki. In chapter 1033, Zoro is shown using a form of Haki that seems to predict his opponent's movements, a skill close to a vision beyond the normal. Mihawk's training prepared him for that ability, but perhaps the eye injury was the key that pushed him to reach that level of perception. Sensing the flow of the world around him isn't something any swordsman could do, but for Zoro, with one eye closed, it became a necessity. When his observation Haki intensifies, Zoro can see through battle, feel danger before it happens, and react without needing to focus visually, fighting guided not by sight but by spirit. Zoro had already shown an impressive ability to handle pain and challenges since the beginning of his journey. When he loses to Kuina early in the series, it's a lesson about physical limitations, but also about overcoming them through willpower. However, the loss of his eye during training with Mihawk, or due to the creatures on the island, takes this to a whole new level. He's not just learning how to fight, he's learning how to survive in a world where physical limitations can be transcended through mind and spirit. This kind of training shapes Zoro into a truly unique swordsman. Returning to the idea of Mihawk and his training, it's important to note that despite his cold demeanor, Mihawk was never someone who destroyed his disciples for no reason. He always sought to develop Zoro on a deeper level, forcing him to go beyond his own limits. The cut on his eye could be seen as a way to create a new challenge for Zoro, a loss that in some way would open the door to a new style of combat, one focused more on spiritual perception than physical sight. Mihawk knew that Zoro wouldn't become the swordsman he is without that loss. It was a kind of symbolic death, where the old Zoro, perhaps the more reckless and brute force version, ceased to exist, giving way to a refined swordsman, more aware and more capable of using every tool the world had to offer. Let's connect that to Zoro's post-scar development, where he becomes a cutting machine. In chapter 599, Zoro returns with his eye closed, but his power skyrockets. He slices a galleon with a casual swing, proving that the loss didn't weaken him, it made him stronger. In chapter 909, in Wano, he handles samurai as if they were toys. And in chapter 1033, against King, he masters Enma, the sword that drains Haki, shouting that he will become the king of hell. That's the result of Mihawk's training, where the cut on the eye symbolizes the sacrifice required to master Conqueror's Haki. Mihawk, back in chapter 51, spared Zoro because he saw potential. In chapter 597, he agreed to train him, shaping that potential through pain. The scar on his eye is like the one on his chest, a mark of rebirth, forcing Zoro to rely less on sight and more on instinct. Just as Rayleigh teaches Luffy about Haki in chapter 597, saying that true power comes from perception beyond the senses. Revisiting earlier arcs to sharpen this blade even more, in chapter 3, Zoro already loses an eye and spirit when he's captured, yet he fights with determination. That moment echoes his resilience. In chapter 597, when Zoro arrives on Mihawk's island, he's wounded and humble, ready to pay any price. Mihawk, living among gorillas that fight like demons, probably imposed training where mistakes were costly. One slip, and you lose an eye, teaching Zoro never to blink in battle. In chapter 1110, in Egghead, Zoro cuts Lucci with surgical precision, even with one eye, suggesting that the loss enhanced his focus. Mihawk might have cut Zoro's eye to simulate real-world disadvantages, fights against enemies who blind or deceive, preparing him for a world where perfect vision isn't enough. That was today's content. We hope you liked it and want to share your opinion on the subject. Don't forget to share the video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care and stay amazing.